There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the New England countryside in the late hours of autumn. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of depth, the kind that rises from old ground, from soil that has been turned and packed and settled over centuries, from stone walls that run through forests where no roads exist anymore, from cellar holes half hidden by fallen leaves, and the slow, patient work of tree roots widening their reach year after year. If you have ever walked through a New England woodland far enough from any road to forget the sound of traffic, you may have noticed that the ground itself seems to carry weight. Not just the weight of the trees above it, or the accumulated debris of 100 seasons, but something older, a sense that the land remembers things that no living person does. It is in those moments, standing at the edge of a depression in the earth that might once have been a foundation, or following a granite wall that leads nowhere and everywhere at once, that a question begins to form quietly in the back of the mind. What is beneath this ground, and what did the people who lived and worked and built here long before us place there? New England is a landscape of layers. Its surface is readable enough, in a way. The colonial farmhouses, the white church steeples, the covered bridges, the small downtown blocks of brick and granite. These are the things that appear on postcards and in travel guides, the recognizable face of a region with a long and documented history. But beneath that surface, the story becomes considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. There are foundations beneath foundations. There are passages that have been sealed and forgotten. There are spaces that were built for entirely ordinary reasons and later transformed by time and imagination and the persistent human habit of storytelling into something that feels far more mysterious than a root cellar or a mill drain ever should. This documentary is an attempt to look honestly at what lies beneath New England, not to frighten anyone, and not to manufacture a mystery where none exists, but to follow the evidence wherever it genuinely leads. And it leads, as it turns out, through some fascinating and unexpected territory. Before we go any further, if you find yourself returning to history's sleepy time for these long, quiet journeys through American history, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. It helps more people find their way here, and it allows this kind of storytelling to continue. Now back to the ground beneath our feet. The word tunnel is worth pausing on. When most people hear it, they imagine something specific, a long horizontal passage, supported overhead, going from one place to another through solid ground or stone. And some of what we will discuss fits that description precisely. But the history of underground New England is considerably wider than that single image. It includes cellars and their connecting passages. It includes drainage channels carved through granite hillsides. It includes the underground vaults of old ice houses, the magazine chambers of coastal forts, the maintenance tunnels beneath 19th-century mill complexes, and the buried street-level passages of cities that grew upward over themselves. It includes stone chambers whose origins researchers have debated for generations, and it includes a rich tradition of folklore that has wrapped itself around all of these real structures until, in some cases, it becomes difficult to see where the documented history ends and the story begins. That is the central question of this documentary. Not simply what is underground in New England, but what we actually know about it. What has been documented, what has been misidentified, what has been legitimately forgotten, and what has been invented, affectionately, enthusiastically invented, by people who found ordinary history insufficient and preferred a better story. Because New England, more than perhaps any other region of the United States, has a long and deeply rooted tradition of layering stories onto its landscape. And some of those stories, as we will see, are far more interesting than the tunnels themselves. We begin at the surface, because that is where every underground story starts, with the landscape itself, and with the people who first began to shape it. To understand why New England's underground history is so rich and so complicated, you have to understand the ground itself. Not the ground as it exists now, underneath old farms and city streets and parking lots and restored colonial village greens, but the ground as it was shaped over an immense span of geological time, long before any human being walked across it. New England sits on some of the oldest and most complex bedrock in North America. The rocks that form the foundations of Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine are ancient, in many places genuinely ancient, dating back hundreds of millions of years to the Paleozoic era and beyond. These are metamorphic and igneous rocks, primarily granite, schist, quartzite, gneiss, rocks that were once other things, buried and transformed by heat and pressure over geological spans of time that make human history feel like a brief shimmer on an old river. Granite is the defining material of New England in a way that goes far beyond aesthetics. It is the bedrock, literally and culturally, and it has shaped everything that human beings have done in this landscape, including what they have built underground. The most recent major chapter in New England's geological story was the last glacial maximum, the period roughly between 25,000 and 12,000 years ago, when the Laurentide ice sheet covered the region under glacial ice that in places reached a mile or more in thickness. This was not a slow, steady presence. It was a dynamic, grinding, reshaping force, and when it finally retreated northward, it left a landscape that was fundamentally different from what had existed before. The glaciers carved valleys, deposited massive quantities of rock debris, boulders, gravel, sand, scoured the bedrock into rounded shapes, dug out lake basins, redirected rivers, and left behind an endlessly varied surface of hills and kettles and eskers and drumlin fields. They also left behind an enormous number of loose boulders, some of them enormous, scattered across a landscape that would later strike European settlers as both resource and obstacle. Those boulders matter to our story. Because when colonists began clearing land and building in New England, the first thing many of them encountered, in quantities almost unimaginable by the standards of the regions they came from, was stone. Fieldstone, granite boulders, outcrops pushing up through thin soil, ledged just inches below the surface of what looked like farmable ground. Stone was simultaneously the problem and the solution. It could not simply be removed and discarded. There was too much of it, and discarding it would have required more labor than the colonists had available. So they used it. They built with it. They stacked it into the thousands of miles of stone walls that still define the New England countryside. They quarried it for building stone and for the foundation blocks of their homes, and they used it underground. The topography that the glaciers left behind, the hills, the valleys, the natural depressions, the drainage patterns, also directly influenced where people chose to build and how they solved the practical problems of storing food, managing water, and sheltering themselves and their animals through the long, cold winters. New England winters are genuinely demanding. They are cold enough and long enough that the preservation of food from the autumn harvest until the following spring was not a convenience. It was a matter of survival. And the solution to that problem, for most of early New England's history, lay underground. There is something worth noting about the way New England's landscape creates a natural environment for underground construction. The granite bedrock, while hard, is often fractured along predictable lines, which means that with enough labor, it can be removed in useful pieces. The hillsides of many New England towns provided natural slopes into which a cellar could be cut, so that the earth itself became one wall of the structure, and the stone that was removed in the process of excavation could be used to build the remaining walls. This is not mysterious. It is practical engineering carried out by people who had limited resources and significant problems to solve. But it is the foundation, literally the foundation, of the underground history we are exploring. The rivers of New England played an equally important role. Rivers like the Merrimack, the Connecticut, the Kennebec, the Penobscot, the Blackstone, and the Thames were not simply picturesque features of the colonial landscape. They were the primary source of power for the Industrial Revolution that transformed New England in the 19th century. And the mills and factories that were built along them created underground infrastructure of surprising complexity. Channels, drainage systems, underground waterways called power canals, and the foundations of structures whose remains are still partially visible beneath later construction in dozens of New England cities. We will return to that chapter of the story in time. For now, it is enough to note that the rivers and the stone and the glacial landscape all contributed to making New England a place where underground construction was not unusual. It was the logical response to the environment. There is one more element of the physical landscape worth introducing here, because it recurs throughout this documentary and because it has been the source of considerable misunderstanding. New England does have natural caves. Not in large numbers, and generally not on the scale of the great cave systems found in limestone regions further south and west, the Appalachian cave systems, or the vast karst landscapes of Kentucky and Tennessee. New England's bedrock is primarily granite and related metamorphic rocks, which do not dissolve in water the way limestone does, and so the dramatic underground passages of karst topography are largely absent. But there are exceptions. In parts of Vermont and western Massachusetts, marble and limestone do occur, and in those areas, some genuine cave formation has taken place. There are also talus caves, spaces formed not by water-dissolving rock, but by large boulders and glacial debris piling in ways that create enclosed spaces between them. These occur across the region and are sometimes quite large. And then there are glacially carved rock shelters, not true caves, but deep overhanging ledges or enclosed rock formations that provided natural shelter. All of these, the marble cave systems of Vermont, the Talus caves of Connecticut and Massachusetts, the rock shelters of coastal Maine, are real geological features, and they have their own long histories of human use. But they are not tunnels in any human-constructed sense, and keeping that distinction clear will matter as we move forward. The landscape, then, is the first layer. Ancient rock reshaped by ice, threaded by rivers, covered by thin forest soil. And presenting to the people who would eventually settle here a set of physical challenges and physical resources that would together produce an underground world, both more real and more varied than the legends that have grown up around it. And once the first peoples began moving through this landscape, long before any European vessel appeared on the Atlantic horizon, that underground world was already beginning to take form. The first European settlers arrived in New England in the early 17th century. And they came to a landscape that had already been inhabited, managed, and shaped by indigenous peoples. Primarily the Algonquian-speaking nations of the region, including the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Pocumtuck, the Mohegan, the Pequot, the Narragansett, the Abenaki, the Pennacook, and many others, for thousands of years. The newcomers came with their own traditions of building, their own understanding of materials, and a set of immediate practical problems that the New England environment was not going to make easy. The first thing that many early settlers built was not a house. It was a hole in the ground. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The earliest form of shelter adopted by many of the first English settlers in New England was a dugout, a partial or full excavation into a hillside or bank, lined with whatever materials were available, and covered with timber and sod or bark. These structures were not inspired by indigenous building traditions, though the settlers would have observed a variety of native construction methods. They were inspired by similar emergency structures known in England and in the early colonial settlements further south, and they were adopted because they were fast, because they were warm, and because building them required less skilled labor and fewer prepared materials than a framed house. They were not meant to be permanent. They were meant to keep people alive through the first winter, and many of them did exactly that. But even as framed houses began to replace the dugouts, the underground space did not disappear. It moved beneath the house and became the cellar, and the cellar became one of the most important spaces in the New England domestic economy for the next 2 centuries. The purpose of the colonial cellar was almost entirely practical. New England winters, as already noted, are long and cold. Summer produce root vegetables, apples, cider, preserved meats, dried herbs, stored grain, needed to survive from the harvest through to the following growing season, and the cellar provided the conditions necessary for that survival. Below the frost line, the temperature of the earth remains relatively stable throughout the year. In most of New England, that means a cellar dug deep enough will hold somewhere between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit through both summer and winter, cold enough to slow spoilage significantly, warm enough to prevent freezing. This is not refrigeration in the modern sense, but it is enormously useful, and for farming families without access to any other form of long-term cold storage, it was essential. Colonial cellars were not simple pits. They were carefully constructed spaces. The walls were typically built of fieldstone laid without mortar in what builders called dry-laid construction, or in some cases set in a lime-based mortar. The floors might be packed earth or stone, or in wealthier households sometimes brick. The ceiling was the underside of the house's ground floor, supported by heavy timber beams, the sills and joists that formed the structural skeleton of the house above. Access was typically by a stair or ladder from inside the house, though many cellars also had a separate exterior entry, a set of slanted wooden doors set into the ground at the base of the foundation, opening onto a short stair that descended to the cellar floor. This arrangement, common throughout New England and still recognizable today on many old farmhouses, was practical for moving heavy goods in and out without carrying them through the living quarters above. It also became, in the imagination of later generations, one of the most potent visual symbols of hidden passages and secret access. Root cellars were a related but distinct structure. While the cellar was typically beneath the house itself, the root cellar was often a freestanding underground structure built into a hillside some distance from the house. The hillside provided natural insulation on three sides, and the structure was excavated into the slope and covered with earth and sometimes sod to provide additional insulation from above. A stone-lined interior, a wooden door set into the slope, and a ventilation arrangement of some kind completed the basic design. Root cellars like this were common across New England from the 17th century onward, and many of them survive today, not always recognized for what they are, because they are often built into hillsides away from any standing structure. Because the houses that once accompanied them have long since rotted or been demolished, and because they are often partially concealed by decades of vegetative growth, freestanding root cellars are among the structures most frequently misidentified by later observers as mysterious chambers of unknown origin. We will return to that question of misidentification in the next chapter, because it is central to understanding how the mythology of New England's underground spaces developed. But first, it is worth appreciating just how thoroughly underground space permeated the colonial and early American domestic landscape. Beyond the house cellar and the root cellar, there were springhouses, structures built over natural springs to take advantage of the constant cold temperature of groundwater, used for keeping milk and butter fresh through the warmer months. There were ice houses, which by the late 18th century had become common among prosperous New England households. An ice house was typically a heavily insulated underground or semi-underground structure where blocks of ice cut from frozen ponds during the winter were packed in sawdust and stored, providing a reliable source of cool temperatures through the summer. The ice trade, which would eventually become a significant New England industry in the 19th century, with ice being shipped as far as India and the Caribbean from the frozen ponds of Massachusetts and Maine, had its origins in these private household structures. There were also the underground components of various craft and industrial operations. Tanneries required pits in which hides were soaked with tannin-rich bark. Breweries required cool underground fermentation spaces. Dairies required cellars for aging cheese. Blacksmiths sometimes used partially underground forge arrangements to improve draft. None of these are particularly mysterious, but all of them contributed to a landscape that was riddled beneath the surface with enclosed, purposeful underground spaces that served the practical requirements of colonial life. The question of connected passages, house-to-house tunnels, or tunnels running from a house to a barn or outbuilding is more complicated. There is a persistent tradition in many New England towns of stories about tunnels connecting colonial-era buildings. The town minister's house to the church, one tavern to another, a wealthy family's home to a neighbor's property. Some of these stories invoke very specific explanations: escape routes for loyalists during the Revolution, passages used by runaway enslaved people on their way north, tunnels dug against the threat of indigenous raids during the colonial wars of the 17th century. Each of these explanations sounds historically plausible on its surface, but the actual physical evidence for most of them is, at best, uncertain. Historians and architectural scholars who have investigated specific claims of colonial tunnel networks have generally found that the physical evidence, when it exists at all, points toward more mundane explanations. A connecting passage between two buildings might be an above-ground covered walkway that rotted away and was later remembered as an underground passage. A low stone-lined drain running away from a foundation might be interpreted by later investigators as the remains of a tunnel floor. A shared cellar wall between two adjacent structures might generate a local tradition of a connecting passage, even when no doorway ever existed. This is not to say that no connected passages were ever built in colonial New England. Some almost certainly were, for entirely practical reasons of accessing fuel storage or livestock in extreme weather without going outside. But the connected colonial passage, when it existed, was a practical convenience for people who faced genuine hardship in New England winters, not a secret escape route. The dramatic narratives came later. One category of connected underground space that is historically documented deserves particular mention. In several New England towns and cities, 18th and early 19th century commercial districts developed underground cisterns and drainage systems that connected multiple properties. Fire was a constant and devastating threat to colonial and early American towns built largely of wood, and the establishment of underground cisterns, large stone-lined tanks for storing water for firefighting, was a practical response. In some cities, these cisterns were connected by underground channels that allowed water to flow from one location to another, or were served by common underground supply pipes made of bored-out logs or later of iron. Boston, in particular, developed an underground water supply system of considerable complexity in the 19th century, and the remains of earlier cistern networks are occasionally encountered during modern construction. These are documented infrastructure, and they contribute genuinely to the underground map of New England's cities. But they are drainage and water management systems. They are engineering, not mystery. There is something worth sitting with for a moment in all of this practical history. The people who built these cellars and root cellars and cisterns and drainage channels were not thinking about posterity's imagination. They were thinking about food and water and warmth and survival. They were solving the problems that the New England environment set before them with the materials and techniques that were available. The underground spaces they created were the unglamorous, essential infrastructure of daily life. The mystery, the sense that something hidden and significant lies beneath the familiar surface, came later, generated by the natural human tendency to find meaning in the unfamiliar, to tell stories about the past that are more interesting than the ordinary truth. But there is one category of underground structure in New England that complicates this picture considerably. One category where the ordinary explanation is genuinely insufficient, where the evidence is genuinely uncertain, and where even careful researchers have found it difficult to reach confident conclusions. These are the stone chambers, the dry-laid stone structures found scattered across New England's countryside, some of them clearly identifiable as root cellars, and some of them considerably more ambiguous than that. That is where the story becomes more interesting. Scattered across the hills and farmlands of southern New England, concentrated particularly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and the southeastern corner of New Hampshire. With examples reaching into Vermont and Maine, there exists a population of dry-laid stone structures that do not fit neatly into the story told so far. They are not simply root cellars, though some of them were almost certainly used as root cellars at some point in their history. They are not simple foundation remnants. They are small enclosed structures, typically built of flat granite or schist slabs, with corbelled or linteled stone roofs, stone-lined interiors, and low, narrow entranceways oriented in various directions. Some are partially buried in hillsides. Some are entirely freestanding. Some are roofed with a single massive capstone resting on upright slabs. Some are connected to stone walls that extend outward from their entrances. Their interiors are often cool and dark and dry, conditions that, as we have already noted, are ideal for food storage. The question of who built them, and when, and for what purpose, has occupied researchers, amateur enthusiasts, and local storytellers for well over a century. And the honest answer, after all that attention, is that most of them were almost certainly built by European colonial farmers, typically in the 18th or early 19th century, as agricultural storage structures. That is the conclusion reached by the majority of archaeologists and historical scholars who have examined the sites based on the construction techniques, used the presence of iron tool marks on some stones, the historical land records that occasionally reference them directly, and the overall pattern of their distribution across the landscape, which tends to correspond with areas of intensive colonial-era farming activity. But that answer, while probably correct for the majority of the structures, has proven difficult to establish definitively for all of them, and that difficulty is the opening through which a great deal of interpretive speculation has entered the conversation. The structures are sometimes called stone chambers, sometimes stone beehives, sometimes corbelled stone huts, sometimes simply mystery chambers. They range in size from small niches barely large enough for a single person to enter on hands and knees, to structures large enough to stand upright in, with interior dimensions of perhaps 8 or 10 feet by 4 or 5 feet, and ceiling heights of 5 or 6 feet. The quality of construction varies considerably. Some are rough and utilitarian, stacked fieldstone with no great care for regularity or finish. Others are more carefully built, with smoothed surfaces, deliberate coursing of the stonework, and entranceways that appear to have been planned with some intention. A smaller number have interior niches, shelf-like projections of stone, or other features that go somewhat beyond what a simple root cellar would require. The most widely discussed concentration of these structures is in the hill country of south-central New Hampshire. At a site long known by the evocative name Mystery Hill, and more recently and more neutrally as America's Stonehenge. Though that name itself carries considerable argumentative baggage, since it implies a connection to the prehistoric monument in Wiltshire, England, which the evidence does not support. The site, located in North Salem, New Hampshire, consists of a collection of stone chambers, stone walls, and stone arrangements spread across a hillside, along with a large flat stone, sometimes called the sacrificial table, by enthusiasts who have proposed dramatic interpretations. The site was popularized in the 20th century, particularly after a New England businessman named William Goodwin purchased it in the 1930s and began promoting the theory that it was the work of Irish monks who had crossed the Atlantic in the early medieval period, an idea that has not been accepted by mainstream archaeology. Later advocates proposed other pre-Columbian origins, including Phoenician, Celtic, and Iberian. None of these theories have found support in the peer-reviewed archaeological literature. What is actually known about the North Salem site is considerably more complicated. Archaeological investigations conducted over the years have produced radiocarbon dates from charcoal found in association with some of the stone features, and some of those dates do reach back to the late prehistoric period, suggesting that the site or portions of it may have been used by indigenous peoples before European contact. This is not particularly surprising. The hills of southern New Hampshire were inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and any prominent hilltop site with natural rock features would have been known and likely used by them. But the presence of pre-contact use does not establish that the stone constructions themselves are pre-contact in origin. The radiocarbon dates come from charcoal in the soil, not from the construction of the stone features, and there are significant complications in interpreting the stratigraphy of the site. Mainstream archaeologists have generally concluded that the stone features visible today are most plausibly of colonial or post-colonial construction, though they acknowledge that the full history of the site is not entirely resolved. The broader population of New England stone chambers has been surveyed by researchers including the late Curtis Hoffman, an archaeologist at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts, who spent considerable effort documenting and analyzing these structures. The work of researchers like Hoffman represents the kind of methodical, evidence-based approach that is essential to understanding what these structures actually are. His investigations and those of other archaeologists have consistently found that the structures, when they can be dated or contextualized through documentary evidence, tend to be of colonial-era agricultural origin. Property records, deeds, and early maps occasionally reference the structures directly as storage features. In some cases, iron hardware remnants or other datable materials have been found within or adjacent to them. The construction techniques are generally consistent with colonial-era dry-laid stone building. None of this is to say that there is nothing interesting about these structures. Their survival in significant numbers across the New England landscape is genuinely noteworthy. Their construction, even for agricultural purposes, represents considerable skill and labor. The fact that so many of them have been separated from their historical context by the decay of the farmsteads they once served, the farmhouses gone, the fields grown back to forest, the people who built them long dead, is a real and melancholy kind of historical loss. A structure that was once the perfectly ordinary root cellar of a farming family becomes, when it is found alone in a forest with no remaining context, an invitation to imagination. And human beings, as we have noted, rarely resist that invitation. There is one genuinely unresolved aspect of New England's stone chamber tradition that deserves careful acknowledgement. A smaller number of the chambers, when examined closely, display orientations or features that are more difficult to explain as purely agricultural. Some researchers have noted that certain chambers appear to be oriented toward significant solar events, solstice sunrises, equinox sunsets, in ways that seem unlikely to have been accidental, but also difficult to verify without eliminating alternative explanations. Whether these orientations are intentional, incidental, or the result of selective observation by researchers already looking for meaningful patterns, is genuinely disputed. The archaeoastronomical study of stone structures in New England remains a minority interest within the academic archaeology community, and it has not produced the kind of controlled, peer-reviewed analysis that would allow for confident conclusions. The honest assessment is that most chambers were almost certainly built as agricultural storage. A smaller number may have been built with additional intentions that are no longer recoverable, and a very small number present features that remain genuinely puzzling to careful observers, while remaining entirely unpuzzling to those who are already convinced of their predetermined interpretation. What is clear is that the stone chambers of New England are not the work of Celts, Phoenicians, Templars, Vikings, or any other pre-Columbian European civilization. No credible archaeological evidence supports those theories. The tools, the construction methods, the historical record, and the geographic distribution of the structures all point consistently toward colonial New England farmers and the practical demands of agricultural storage in a cold climate. The mystery, if there is one, lies not in the structures themselves, but in the human tendency to see mystery where documented history does not fully satisfy the imagination, and in the genuine difficulty, which is real, of establishing the exact history of individual structures when the documentary record is incomplete. That said, these stone chambers are not the only underground spaces in New England that have resisted easy classification. Because the 19th century brought a new kind of underground space to the region, one that was unambiguously real, unambiguously large, and created not by farmers storing turnips, but by the forces of industrial capitalism reshaping the landscape at a scale that the colonial period could scarcely have imagined. Sometime around 1793, a group of investors and engineers standing beside the Pawtucket Falls on the Blackstone River in northeastern Rhode Island made a decision that would change New England's landscape and its underground more thoroughly than anything since the retreat of the glaciers. They were planning a textile mill, not the first in New England, but one of the first to apply the fully mechanized spinning and weaving processes developed in England, and the mill they built at what became the city of Pawtucket helped initiate a wave of industrial development that would, over the following century, fill the river valleys of New England with factories, canals, waterways, and the infrastructure to support them. The key to understanding how the Industrial Revolution reshaped New England's underground is water. These early mills were powered by water, by the controlled movement of rivers through channels, over wheels, and through gates, generating mechanical power that drove the looms and spinning frames inside the mill buildings. And water management at the scale required by the great industrial mill complexes that grew up along the Merrimack, the Connecticut, the Blackstone, the Saco, the Androscoggin, and a dozen other rivers, required engineering of considerable complexity and considerable ambition. Much of that engineering went underground. The power canal systems built to serve the great mill cities of New England are among the most remarkable achievements of 19th-century American engineering, and they are largely invisible today, or at least invisible at the surface. In Lowell, Massachusetts, which was planned and built from scratch beginning in the 1820s specifically to harness the power of the Merrimack River, a system of power canals was excavated through the city that eventually totaled several miles in length. These canals were not simply open ditches. They were carefully engineered channels, lined in many places with granite, controlled by gates and guard locks, and designed to distribute water from the river to the turbines and water wheels of the various mill complexes at carefully calculated heights and flow rates. Much of this canal system ran at or near ground level and can still be seen in Lowell today, where a National Historical Park preserves significant portions of the infrastructure. But portions of the system also ran underground, through culverts and covered channels that allowed the canals to pass beneath streets, beneath mill buildings, and beneath the expanding fabric of the industrial city. These underground sections were essentially large stone-lined tunnels, in some cases quite large, carrying significant volumes of moving water through the urban landscape. Lowell is the most thoroughly documented example, but similar canal and waterway systems were built in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the Merrimack, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Further down the same river in Chicopee and Holyoke, on the Connecticut, in Lewiston, Maine, on the Androscoggin, and in various other industrial centers across the region. Each of these systems created underground infrastructure that was, at the time, well known and well documented. It was industrial engineering, not secret construction. But as the mills declined through the late 19th and 20th centuries, as the water power systems were replaced by steam and then electricity, as the mill buildings were repurposed or demolished, and as the industrial landscape was gradually transformed into post-industrial neighborhoods and parking lots and shopping centers and condominiums. The underground components of these systems became progressively less visible and progressively less understood by the people living above them. In some places, the old power canals were simply built over, their channels roofed with concrete or stone or soil, their existence recorded in old engineering surveys, but not in the common understanding of the neighborhood. Workers doing modern utility excavations in former mill cities periodically break through into old canal sections, finding granite-lined chambers flowing with water or standing dry and empty. In others, sections of the old underground waterways have been deliberately sealed and forgotten, and occasionally, explorers with a taste for urban history have found their way into surviving sections of these underground industrial waterways and documented what they found: granite walls wet with seepage, the old iron hardware of gates and regulators still in place. The scale of the construction suggesting an industrial ambition that the surface streetscape no longer remembers. Beyond the water systems, the great mill complexes themselves created underground spaces of considerable variety. Mill basements were typically large, heavily built stone spaces with access to the water systems that powered the turbines, and many of them were connected by underground passages to boiler houses, fuel storage areas, and neighboring mill buildings. The need to move fuel materials and workers between buildings in all-weather conditions, and the practical advantages of keeping certain operations at consistent temperatures below the frost line drove the construction of connecting passages between adjacent mill buildings. Passages that were again entirely practical and entirely documented in their time. But that became progressively more mysterious as the industrial operations they served were shut down and dismantled. The granite quarrying industry, which was itself one of the defining industries of 19th century New England, produced underground spaces of a different character. The great granite quarries of Quincy, Massachusetts, sometimes called the Granite City, Cape Ann, Rockport, Barr and Milford in Vermont, and numerous other locations across the region, are among the most historically significant industrial landscapes in New England. At their peak in the late 19th century, these quarries employed thousands of workers and supplied building stone for projects across the entire country. The process of quarrying granite on an industrial scale involved a combination of drilling, blasting, channeling, and splitting, and it left behind landscapes of dramatic vertical-walled pits, long, narrow channeling cuts, and underground drainage systems that are still visible in the abandoned quarry sites that survive today. But the quarrying industry also drove the construction of underground passages for a specific and practical purpose: transporting stone from the quarry floor to the processing and loading areas above. In some quarries, inclined tunnels were cut through the rock to allow stone to be moved by gravity, or later by cable and mechanical systems, from the deep quarry floor to the surface. These inclines and passages, carved directly into the granite bedrock, are among the most genuinely dramatic underground spaces in New England, and some of them survive in a remarkably preserved condition in the abandoned quarry landscapes that have been protected or preserved for historical purposes. The Quincy quarries, in particular, preserve evidence of this kind of underground infrastructure, and the Granite Railway, which began operation in 1826 and is sometimes cited as the first commercial railroad in the United States, was connected to underground stone hauling systems within the quarry complex. Railroad tunnels represent another category of genuine and well-documented underground infrastructure in New England. As the railroad network expanded across the region through the middle and late 19th century, the builders encountered the same obstacle that had challenged colonists and industrial engineers before them. New England's granite hills and mountains are not easily routed around. The solution was to go through them. A number of significant railroad tunnels were constructed in New England during the railroad building era, and several of them remain in use today. The Hoosac Tunnel in northwestern Massachusetts is the most significant of these, and it merits some attention both for its engineering achievement and for the history of its construction. The Hoosac Tunnel runs approximately 4.75 miles through the Hoosac Mountain, or the Hoosac Range, as it is sometimes called, in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts. When it was completed in 1875, after a construction period of approximately 22 years, it was the longest railroad tunnel in North America and one of the longest in the world. The construction was genuinely harrowing. Workers used recently developed nitroglycerin-based explosives, some of the first large-scale uses of such explosives in American construction, and encountered a series of engineering disasters, including floods, fires, and accidental explosions that killed a substantial number of workers over the course of the project. The human cost of the Hoosac Tunnel was real and significant, and it is not surprising that the tunnel accumulated legends and ghost stories in the decades following its completion. The deaths that occurred during construction, the darkness and scale of the passage, and the dramatic circumstances of some of the accidents created a body of local storytelling that has persisted to the present day. What is worth noting is that the documented history of the tunnel's construction is genuinely dramatic enough without embellishment. The real story, with its engineering ambition, its human cost, and its ultimate success in connecting the economically isolated Connecticut River Valley with the Port of Boston, is among the most compelling chapters in New England's industrial history. Smaller railroad tunnels exist elsewhere across New England, in Vermont, in Maine, in New Hampshire, in Connecticut. Most of them are simply functional infrastructure, unremarkable except to railroad historians and to the passengers who ride through them without giving them much thought. But they are real underground spaces, bored through real mountains, and they are part of the layered underground landscape that the 19th century built into the New England countryside. There is one more category of industrial underground space worth introducing before we move into the cities: the ice industry. In the first half of the 19th century, Frederick Tudor of Boston, known in his day as the Ice King, built an export business based on harvesting natural ice from New England's frozen ponds and lakes. and shipping it in specially insulated vessels to markets in the American South, in the Caribbean, and eventually in Asia and Europe. The ice trade required not only the harvest and transport infrastructure, but also the storage infrastructure, large underground ice houses where the harvested blocks could be packed in sawdust and held through the warmer months without significant melting loss. The great ice houses of the Tudor trade and of the many companies that followed his model were typically semi-underground structures built into hillsides, heavily insulated and of considerable size, capable of holding thousands of tons of ice. Many of them were located in the lake districts of New Hampshire and Maine, where natural ice was most reliably available in quantity. As with the mill infrastructure and the quarry passages, these structures were well documented in their active period and became progressively less familiar as the natural ice industry was replaced by mechanical refrigeration after the 1880s. The physical remains of some of them, stone foundations, excavated hillside niches, drainage channels, are still occasionally found in the countryside, stripped of context and occasionally generating local speculation about their origins. What all of these industrial spaces have in common is their ordinariness, in the best sense of that word. They were built by working people solving practical problems with the materials and technology available to them. They were documented in engineering surveys, in company records, in newspaper accounts, in the memories of the communities that depended on them. They became mysterious only when the documentation faded and the physical evidence was separated from its historical context, when the mill was demolished and only the underground waterway remained when the quarry was abandoned and only the incline passage survived. When the ice house was forgotten and only the stone foundation in the hillside remained to puzzle later walkers by. The transition from documented infrastructure to mysterious underground space is not always a long journey. Sometimes it takes only a generation or two. And in the cities, that transition happened on a far grander and more complicated scale. Cities accumulate underground space the way sediment accumulates in a river delta, slowly at first, then more rapidly, layer upon layer, each generation adding to what those before it built, and sometimes burying the earlier layers entirely. The cities of New England are old by American standards. Boston was founded in 1630, Providence in 1636, Hartford in 1636, New Haven in 1638, Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1630, Portland, Maine in the same era. These are not young cities. They have had nearly 4 centuries to accumulate layers, and what lies beneath their streets reflects that accumulated time in ways that are occasionally surprising and occasionally genuinely remarkable. Boston presents perhaps the most dramatic example of an urban underground, partly because of its age and partly because of a peculiarity of its geography. The Boston that exists today bears only a partial resemblance to the Boston that the first settlers encountered. The original Shawmut Peninsula, the narrow landform connected to the mainland by a thin neck of land, was a much smaller place than the modern city. Over the course of the 18th, and especially the 19th and 20th centuries, The surrounding tidal flats and shallow coves were filled in with enormous quantities of material, gravel, sand, rubble, and earth, dramatically expanding the land area of the city. The Back Bay neighborhood, the South End, large portions of East Boston and South Boston, and most of the area known as the Seaport District are all built on filled land. Beneath those neighborhoods, at varying depths, the original tidal flat or shallow harbor bottom still exists, and within some of those filled areas, the remains of older structures, buried streets, and filled waterways create underground stratigraphy of considerable complexity. The construction history of downtown Boston adds additional layers. The oldest parts of the city, the Beacon Hill neighborhood, the area around the old State House, the waterfront district, contain building foundations that date back to the 17th century, and in some cases, those early foundations have been built over incorporated into later buildings, or simply left in place when later construction went up around and above them. Urban archaeologists working in Boston over the past several decades have recovered remarkable evidence of the city's early history from beneath its streets, including fragments of early colonial structures, buried wharves, and sea walls from the era when the shoreline ran through what is now well inland from the current waterfront privies, and refuse pits that have preserved organic materials from the colonial period, and traces of streets and pathways that were absorbed into later development and are no longer visible at the surface. The most famous element of Boston's underground history, at least in terms of popular recognition, is the subway system, specifically the Tremont Street subway, which opened in 1897 and is generally credited as the first subway tunnel in the United States. The construction of the Boston subway system, which was driven by the increasingly impossible traffic congestion on the surface streets of what was by then a major industrial and commercial city, required tunneling through the accumulated deposits of nearly 3 centuries of urban development. The workers who dug the early subway tunnels encountered the buried evidence of earlier Boston at regular intervals: old foundations, buried utilities, decayed wooden pipes from early water systems, and occasionally artifacts from the colonial period. The construction was documented, and some of the archaeological finds were recorded by the engineers and workers involved, though the systematic approach to urban archaeology that would be applied to major construction projects today was not yet developed. The subway expanded steadily over the following decades, and the tunnels and stations of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority now form an extensive underground network beneath Boston and its inner suburbs, an entirely documented, thoroughly engineered piece of infrastructure that is nonetheless surprisingly unfamiliar to most of the people who use it every day. Beneath the subway tunnels, the even older underground of Boston continues. The city's combined sewer and stormwater system, portions of which date to the mid-19th century, runs through tunnels and pipes of varying ages and materials beneath the streets. The early system, built beginning in the 1870s under the direction of city engineer Joseph Davis, was among the first modern sewage systems in the United States, and it required the construction of substantial underground infrastructure, including brick-lined sewer tunnels large enough for maintenance workers to walk through. Some of the oldest brick sewer tunnels beneath central Boston are genuinely remarkable pieces of mid-Victorian engineering, carefully built with arched brick profiles and mortar joints that have held up through more than a century and a half of use. They are not glamorous, they are not mysterious, but they are, in their own way, an impressive piece of underground history. Providence, Rhode Island, offers its own version of this layered urban underground. The Providence River, which runs through the center of the modern city, was once the head of Narragansett Bay and served as the natural harbor around which the colonial settlement grew. Over the course of the 19th century, portions of the river were channeled, culverted, and eventually covered over entirely as the city expanded. The most dramatic version of this process occurred when the Woonasquatucket and Moshassuck rivers, which joined to form the Providence River, were covered with a massive railroad yard in the late 19th century, burying the rivers beneath tracks and fill, and effectively severing the city's waterfront from its downtown. That railroad infrastructure was itself removed in the 1980s as part of an urban revitalization project, and the rivers were uncovered in what became a celebrated piece of urban river restoration, returning to the surface waters that had been underground for nearly a century. Beneath the streets surrounding the old railroad yard, the underground infrastructure of 19th-century Providence remains. Brick drains, stone culverts, the buried channels of smaller tributaries, the foundations of warehouses and industrial buildings that stood along the old waterfront. New Haven, Connecticut, presents a somewhat different underground history, shaped by its role as a university city and its early grid plan. The Yale University campus has, over its long history, accumulated underground infrastructure of considerable variety: steam tunnels, utility corridors, drainage systems, and the foundations of buildings dating back to the 18th century. Steam tunnels are a common feature beneath large institutional campuses, insulated underground passages through which steam pipes run from central boiler plants to the buildings they heat, and which are large enough, in many cases, for maintenance workers to enter and walk through. The Yale steam tunnel system, portions of which date to the late 19th century, is substantial, and the tunnels pass beneath a significant portion of the campus. They are, again, entirely documented in engineering records and entirely functional as maintenance infrastructure. But their existence is not widely known to the general campus population, and they have generated their share of stories and legends over the years, as such tunnels invariably do. Hartford, Connecticut sits at the intersection of the Connecticut River's floodplain and the older glacial landscape of central Connecticut. And its underground history reflects both its industrial past as a significant manufacturing center through the 19th century, and its role as the insurance and financial capital of 19th century New England. The downtown area of Hartford contains the buried remains of earlier periods of development, including the earthworks and remains of the 17th century settlement and the infrastructure of the city's industrial waterfront on the Connecticut River. The river itself was significantly modified in the late 19th and 20th centuries, with flood control levees and bank stabilization that altered the relationship between the city and the water that had defined its location. Portland, Maine, at the northern end of the region, has its own underground story shaped by the city's role as a major port and its dramatic history of fire. The Great Fire of Portland in 1866 destroyed a significant portion of the city's downtown, and the reconstruction that followed produced a new urban fabric built largely of brick over the ruins of the older wooden city. Beneath the reconstructed downtown, the foundations of the pre-fire buildings, the old wharves, and the buried shoreline of the original harbor combine to produce an underground stratigraphy that urban archaeologists have only partially explored. The waterfront area of Portland, which has been continuously active since the 17th century, contains buried evidence of the city's long maritime history: old wharf pilings, buried ship's ballast, the remains of warehouses and maritime infrastructure from successive periods of the city's development. What all of these urban underground landscapes have in common, and this is worth pausing to consider, is that they are not hidden in any meaningful sense. They are documented in engineering records, in archaeological surveys, in the institutional memory of the city's public works departments and historical societies. They are hidden in the much simpler sense that they are underground, and that most people who live and work above them are not particularly aware of their existence. The gap between documented and publicly known is not the same as the gap between real and invented. New England's urban underground is real, it is documented, and it is largely accessible to anyone who takes the time to look at the right maps and records. But there is a layer of New England's underground history that is genuinely less accessible, not because it has been deliberately hidden, but because it was built for purposes that required discretion, and because the passage of time has covered it in a different kind of obscurity. That is the military underground, the forts, the magazines, the gun batteries, and the Cold War installations that once protected the coast and the cities of New England from threats real and anticipated. New England's coastline is long, and it is complicated, from the rocky headlands of coastal Maine, where the land breaks into the sea in a succession of peninsulas and islands and deep protected harbors, down through the sandy shores of Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, to the sheltered waters of Narragansett Bay and Long Island Sound at the region's southern edge. This coastline has been strategically significant since the first European settlements of the 17th century. It was the avenue through which goods arrived and departed. It was the approach route for any naval threat, and it was, from the earliest days of European presence in New England, a coastline that its inhabitants felt they needed to defend. The history of coastal fortification in New England is long and layered, and much of it went underground in one form or another. The earliest colonial fortifications were simple earthworks, berms and ditches and palisades of timber, quick to construct, relatively cheap in labor, and requiring no specialized engineering knowledge. These early works have left almost no surface trace. The earthworks have eroded and settled over nearly 4 centuries, The timber has long since rotted, and in most cases, later development has obscured whatever might remain of the original construction. But archaeological investigations in several locations, at the site of the early colonial fortification on Castle Island in Boston Harbor, for instance, have revealed buried traces of these early defensive works beneath later construction. Castle Island is worth pausing on because it represents one of the most continuously occupied military sites in the United States, and because its underground history illustrates the process by which military fortifications accumulate layers over time. The island, now connected to the South Boston mainland by a narrow causeway, has been used as a military installation since the 1630s. Over the course of approximately 2.5 centuries, it was rebuilt and expanded repeatedly, with each successive generation of military engineers adding new works, modifying existing structures, and occasionally demolishing earlier construction to make way for more modern defenses. The fort that stands on the island today, Fort Independence, a granite-faced masonry structure completed in its current form in the 1850s, sits atop the buried remains of at least 5 earlier fortifications, each constructed in response to a different perceived military threat, and each incorporating underground elements appropriate to its period. The powder magazine, the underground vault in which gunpowder was stored away from the risk of spark and fire, is a consistent feature of every serious fortification of this era. And Fort Independence's surviving magazine spaces are good examples of the kind of carefully built underground vaulted chambers that were standard military engineering practice from the colonial period through the Civil War. Boston Harbor contains several other fortified islands with underground military infrastructure of varying ages. Fort Warren on George's Island, which served as a significant military prison during the Civil War, contains extensive underground passages and casemated batteries, the casemates being vaulted stone chambers within the walls of the fort, used both for the mounting of artillery and for protected storage and personnel accommodation. The granite construction of Fort Warren is remarkably well preserved, and the underground passages and chambers within its walls give a vivid impression of what life in a mid-19th century coastal fortification actually involved, confined, damp, cold, and dark in the underground portions. With the constant presence of the harbor's salt air and the sound of water working its way through the old stonework. Fort Warren is today managed as part of the Boston Harbor Islands State Park, and visitors can walk through portions of its underground passages, though complete access is limited for safety reasons. Further up the Maine coast, at the mouth of the Kennebec River, Fort Popham was constructed beginning in the 1860s as part of the same wave of coastal fortification that produced or renovated dozens of harbor defenses along the Atlantic seaboard during and after the Civil War. Fort Popham's semicircular granite structure, set directly at the water's edge, includes casemated lower levels designed for protected artillery fire, and its construction involved significant underground work in the form of magazine chambers and connecting passages. The fort was never fully completed, and it was never used in actual combat, but its partially completed state preserves the engineering logic of mid-19th century coastal defense in a particularly readable form. The relationship between the underground magazines, the connecting passages, and the gun positions above gives a clear picture of how military engineers thought about the problem of protecting a harbor approach during the era of muzzle-loading artillery. The most substantial transformation of New England's military underground came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With the development of what military historians call the Endicott system, a program of coastal fortification designed by a board of officers and civilians chaired by Secretary of War William Endicott and implemented beginning in the 1880s. The Endicott system replaced the exposed masonry walls of earlier forts with concealed concrete batteries designed to present the smallest possible target to enemy naval fire while mounting the largest possible guns. These batteries were built into the landscape, typically into hillsides, bluffs, or artificially shaped earthworks, in ways that made them extremely difficult to see from the sea. The gun positions themselves were often retractable, with hydraulic or mechanical systems allowing the guns to rise above the protective concrete walls for firing, and then descend behind them for reloading. And the supporting infrastructure, the ammunition magazines, the plotting and fire control rooms, the generator rooms, the communication passages, was buried underground in reinforced concrete, connected to the gun positions by underground passages of varying size. The Endicott batteries and the later Taft-era batteries that expanded and modified the system in the early 20th century were constructed at numerous locations along the New England coast. Fort H.G. Wright on Fisher's Island off the Connecticut coast. Fort Wetherill in Jamestown, Rhode Island, overlooking the Western Passage into Narragansett Bay. Fort Stark and Fort Dearborn on the New Hampshire coast. Fort McKinley and Fort Lyon on the islands of Portland Harbor in Maine. Fort Williams at Cape Elizabeth, also in Maine, now preserved as a state park. Each of these installations contains underground concrete infrastructure of the Endicott and Taft periods, magazines, plotting rooms, communication passages, and utility spaces buried beneath earth and grass, and in some cases beneath later Cold War construction. The Cold War added its own layer of underground military infrastructure to New England, and that layer deserves acknowledgement even though much of it remains partially restricted. The Nike missile defense system, which was deployed around major American cities beginning in the 1950s, included a network of launch sites and radar installations that ringed Boston and other New England population centers. Each Nike site consisted of above-ground radar and launch facilities and underground magazine and storage areas where the missiles were stored on elevators that raised them to the surface for launch. Several former Nike sites exist within the greater Boston area and in other locations across New England, and their underground components, the underground launch magazines with their elevator systems, are among the more unusual pieces of Cold War infrastructure surviving in the region. More significantly, The Cold War also produced classified underground facilities intended to house command and communications functions in the event of nuclear attack. Some of these facilities are now at least partially declassified, and their existence is publicly known, though the details of their construction and contents remain in many cases restricted. The general pattern, reinforced concrete bunkers buried beneath hills, connected to surface facilities by blast-resistant entrances, was replicated at multiple sites across New England and the broader northeastern United States during the 1950s and 1960s. These facilities represent the most recent major phase of intentional underground construction in New England, and they are in a particular way among the most historically poignant, built against a threat so total that the possibility of needing them was itself almost incomprehensible. And now standing largely empty and silent beneath the hills they were built into. There is something common to all of these military underground spaces that connects them to the broader theme of this documentary. They were built with intention and documented with care. The military, whatever its faults, keeps records. But the documentation is not always publicly accessible. The installations are often physically inaccessible, and the passage of time has separated many of them from the living memory of their purpose. An Endicott battery grown over with grass and brush, its concrete passages dark and water-stained, its machinery long since removed, presents the same invitation to the imagination as an abandoned root cellar in a second-growth forest. The difference is that the military structures are genuinely mysterious to most visitors, not because their history is unknown, but because it is simply unfamiliar. Because the history of American coastal defense in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is not a widely known subject. And because the physical evidence of that history, when encountered without context, can feel like something from a different world. Which is, perhaps, the best possible introduction to the next layer of New England's underground story, the one that has almost nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the human need to make ordinary places extraordinary. There is a cellar beneath a tavern in a small Connecticut town, the kind of town with a white church on the green and a general store that has been selling the same brands of penny candy since 1950, and local tradition holds that the cellar connects by a tunnel to the church across the road. The story varies depending on who tells it. Some versions say the tunnel was used by Loyalists during the Revolution, moving through the dark to avoid the notice of their patriot neighbors. Some say it was a passage for moving contraband rum during Prohibition. A few versions, in the more imaginative tellings, suggest it was dug to allow a colonial minister to move secretly between his home and his congregation in the event of an indigenous raid. None of these stories are supported by physical evidence that historians have been able to identify. The cellar is real. The tunnel, as far as anyone has been able to determine, exists primarily in the tradition. This is an extraordinarily common pattern in New England, and it is worth spending some time understanding why. Because the tradition of tunnel legends is itself a significant piece of the region's cultural history, not evidence of hidden infrastructure, but evidence of something equally interesting: The way communities remember their past, the stories they choose to tell about the ground beneath their feet, and the particular human needs that underground legends seem to satisfy. The underground legend tradition in New England appears to have its deepest roots in the 19th century, though it builds on older anxieties and older stories. By the mid-19th century, the colonial and revolutionary periods of New England's history were already beginning to feel genuinely distant, distant enough to be romanticized, close enough to be specific. The houses, the churches, the taverns, and the town greens of colonial New England were still standing and still inhabited, but the world that had built them was becoming legend. And legend, as it always does, began to fill the spaces that documented history left uncertain. Several recurring story types dominate the New England underground legend tradition, and it is worth examining each of them for what they can tell us about the culture that produced them. The most common is probably the Prohibition Tunnel, the story that a particular cellar, a particular underground passage, or a particular connection between two buildings was used during the 1920s and early 1930s to move bootleg liquor without detection. These stories are especially persistent in port cities and in towns with a tradition of tavern culture, and they have a particular appeal because prohibition is close enough to the present to feel recent, but far enough to feel historical. The visual image of men in hats moving barrels through underground passages in the dark carries a specific period flavor that is genuinely appealing. And while it is certainly true that bootlegging operations during Prohibition sometimes made use of hidden storage spaces and concealed access points, the evidence for elaborate underground tunnel networks specifically constructed for the purpose is generally thin. Bootleggers tended to be practical people working with existing infrastructure, an existing cellar, an existing drainage channel, an existing building with a conveniently placed back door, rather than engaging in major underground construction projects that would have been expensive, labor-intensive, and extremely difficult to conceal. The Loyalist Escape Tunnel and the Revolution-era secret passage represent another major category. The image of colonial Tories fleeing through underground passages while patriot militias searched above ground carries obvious dramatic appeal, and several New England towns have traditions of specific buildings or passages associated with this kind of story. Again, the general historical situation is real. There were genuine loyalists in New England, some of them in precarious situations during and after the Revolution, and some of them did take considerable risks to avoid harassment or worse from their neighbors. But the evidence for underground tunnels specifically constructed for their escape, as opposed to the simpler and equally effective strategies of hiding in cellars, fleeing overland, or simply leaving by ship, has not been found in the form of physical remains that historians have been able to authenticate. The smuggling tunnel, in various formulations, is a third major category. New England has a long and genuine history of maritime smuggling, particularly in the colonial era. When British trade regulations imposed significant costs on merchants who found it more profitable to trade illegally with the Dutch and French Caribbean colonies than to pay the duties that trade with the British colonies would have required. Smuggling was so common and so widely tolerated in colonial New England that it was practically a normal element of the commercial landscape. And some of that smuggling did involve hidden storage, concealed cellars, false floors, spaces beneath wharves where contraband could be temporarily hidden. But the transition from documented hidden storage to elaborate underground tunnel networks is a significant jump, and the physical evidence for the latter, in most specific cases, does not support the tradition. The Underground Railroad, it should be said carefully and clearly, was not primarily an underground structure. It was a network of people, routes, and safe houses, using the word underground in its metaphorical sense of secret and concealed. Enslaved people moving north through New England toward freedom were aided by abolitionists, free black community members, and sympathetic white households who provided food, shelter, temporary hiding places, and guidance. The hiding places they used were primarily exactly that, the ordinary hiding places available in any house: cellars, attics, haylofts, false walls, closets. The evidence for elaborate tunnels specifically constructed for this purpose is, in most cases, not supported by the documentary or physical record, though the topic deserves care and respect. Some genuine hiding spaces were constructed. The Levi Coffin House in Indiana, to take a well-documented example from outside New England, does have a concealed space. But many of the specific tunnel claims made in connection with New England properties have not been substantiated by the archaeological or documentary evidence that historians working on the subject have been able to find. None of this is to diminish the history of New England's abolitionist communities, which was genuine and significant and courageous. It is only to note that the Underground Railroad tunnel legend, like the Prohibition Tunnel and the Loyalist Escape Passage, reflects a cultural pattern of attaching dramatic underground stories to real historical situations in ways that the evidence does not always support, and that ironically can sometimes obscure the genuinely remarkable human history that lies beneath the legend. Why do these stories persist? Why does the underground legend tradition remain so vital in New England, centuries after most of the events it describes? The answer probably involves several things. There is, first, the appeal of the hidden, the universal human fascination with secret spaces, with the idea that familiar places contain depths that ordinary life conceals. A house is just a house until you learn it has a secret passage, and then it becomes something else entirely. There is also the specific quality of New England's built landscape, which is genuinely old and genuinely layered and genuinely full of spaces whose original purpose has been forgotten. When you find an unexplained door in a cellar wall or a stone-lined passage leading away from an old foundation, the temptation to supply an explanation is powerful, and the explanation that satisfies the imagination is rarely the most mundane one available. There is also something specifically New England about the attachment to a layered, significant, historically freighted landscape. This is a region that has always been acutely aware of its own history, sometimes productively, sometimes in ways that have shaded into a self-regarding attachment to the past that filters the complicated actual history through a more appealing legend. The story of underground passages connecting colonial taverns and churches feels like the right kind of history for a region that regards itself as the birthplace of American democracy and American conscience. It is history that is appropriately dramatic, appropriately secretive, appropriately connected to the right causes: liberty, resistance, justice. The more complicated and more ordinary truth that most underground passages are drainage channels and root cellars does not serve the same narrative function, and so it tends to be set aside in favor of the better story. This is not a critique of New England storytelling. It is an observation about the way all human communities relate to their past, through stories that make sense of the landscape and satisfy the need for meaning. The legends of New England's underground spaces are themselves a significant piece of the region's cultural history, worth understanding and worth preserving, as long as they are not confused with the documented record. A legend that is understood as a legend is a window into the culture that produced it. A legend that is presented as historical fact closes that window and opens a different kind of distortion. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the legend leads back to something real. Because underneath the stories of secret passages and escape routes and smugglers' tunnels, there are real cellars and real passages and real underground spaces that the legend has kept in cultural memory even as the original documentary record faded. The story is wrong, but the place is real. And that is where the people who went looking sometimes made their most interesting discoveries. In the summer of 1948, a retired insurance executive from Boston named William Goodwin published a book in which he argued that the stone chambers and other structures at the Mystery Hill site in North Salem, New Hampshire, which he had purchased some years earlier, were the remains of a pre-Columbian Irish monastic settlement constructed by Chaldee monks who had crossed the Atlantic in the early medieval period, centuries before Columbus. Goodwin had spent years and considerable personal resources at the site, excavating, moving stones, and attempting to restore what he believed were the original layouts of the structures. His thesis was rejected by professional archaeologists, who pointed out that his excavations had been conducted without the systematic documentation necessary to establish reliable stratigraphic context, and that the physical evidence of the site was not consistent with Irish monastic construction. But Goodwin's work at Mystery Hill, for all its methodological problems, helped ensure that the site survived and remained a focus of attention, and the questions he raised, even if his answers were wrong, contributed to a broader awareness of the stone chamber tradition that eventually attracted more rigorous investigation. Goodwin's story illustrates something important about the history of underground investigation in New England. The people who have gone looking have come from very different backgrounds and with very different motivations, and the quality and reliability of what they found has varied enormously as a result. At one end of the spectrum are the professional archaeologists, men and women trained in the systematic recovery and interpretation of physical evidence, working within established methodological frameworks, publishing their findings in peer-reviewed literature, and subjecting their conclusions to the scrutiny of the broader scholarly community. The contributions of academic archaeologists to the understanding of New England's underground landscape are real and significant, even if they tend to be less dramatic than the amateur tradition. Researchers like William Ritchie, whose surveys of New England archaeology through the mid-20th century established much of the foundational understanding of the region's prehistoric record, or Dina Dinkors, of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, whose work on New England archaeology over several decades helped establish rigorous standards for the analysis of the region's prehistoric past, worked carefully and methodically to build a picture of what the ground actually contains and what it actually means. Urban archaeology, which developed as a distinct discipline in the United States in the 1970s, brought a similar rigorous approach to the investigation of buried city layers. The early urban archaeology projects in Boston, including investigations at the Central Artery Project, that became one of the largest urban infrastructure undertakings in American history, and which produced a substantial body of archaeological evidence about the city's colonial and post-colonial past, demonstrated that careful systematic excavation in an urban context could recover remarkably detailed information about the lives of ordinary people who had left no significant documentary record. Archaeologists working on the Central Artery Project and on other major construction projects in Boston discovered buried features, including the remains of colonial-era buildings, 18th and 19th century privy pits, filled with household debris, buried portions of early wharves, and evidence of streets and landforms that no longer existed at the surface. This work was conducted under the requirements of federal historic preservation law, which mandates archaeological investigation before significant ground disturbance on federally permitted projects, and it produced findings that have genuinely enriched the understanding of Boston's early history. Providence underwent a similar experience of urban archaeological discovery during the Providence River Relocation Project of the 1980s, which uncovered significant evidence of the 18th and 19th century waterfront beneath the railroad yard that had been built over it. Archaeologists working in advance of the river restoration found buried structural remains, artifacts from the maritime trades, and evidence of the early industrial development of the Providence waterfront that had been entirely invisible at the surface. The project was widely regarded as a successful example of using major urban infrastructure work as an opportunity for archaeological investigation, and it generated publications and museum interpretations that made the findings accessible to the broader public. At the other end of the investigative spectrum from the professional archaeologists are the independent researchers, local historians, enthusiasts, and explorers who have pursued New England's underground spaces through methods ranging from the careful and responsible to the simply unguided. Some of the independent researchers who have contributed to the understanding of New England's underground history have been genuinely valuable, bringing local knowledge, sustained attention, and practical fieldwork skills that academic researchers, constrained by the demands of scholarly publishing and institutional life, have not always been able to provide. The late James Whittall, an amateur archaeologist who worked closely with the Early Sites Research Society of New England, conducted careful fieldwork surveys of stone chamber sites across the region over several decades and produced documentation that, whatever the interpretive disagreements surrounding it, constitutes a genuine contribution to the physical record of the sites. His approach, while methodologically different from academic archaeology and sometimes reaching conclusions that professional archaeologists did not share, was based on sustained observation and careful recording rather than on wishful imagination. Others in the amateur tradition have been less rigorous. The stone chamber sites in particular have attracted a long parade of investigators convinced in advance of their conclusions, people who arrived at the sites already knowing that they would find evidence of ancient Irish monks or Phoenician traders, or pre-Columbian Celtic voyagers, and who interpreted everything they saw in the light of that prior conviction. This approach to investigation, which archaeologists call confirmation bias, produces a distinctive and recognizable kind of finding, one in which every ambiguous feature of a site becomes evidence for the predetermined theory, and every piece of contradictory evidence is explained away or ignored. The literature produced by this tradition is extensive, often enthusiastic, and generally unreliable as a guide to the actual history of the sites. Between the professional academics and the convinced enthusiasts, there is a third group of investigators whose contributions to the understanding of New England's underground have been significant and underappreciated. The engineers, surveyors, local historians, and preservationists who have worked often without institutional support or academic recognition to document and preserve the industrial and infrastructural underground of the region. The people who have mapped the surviving sections of Lowell's power canal system or documented the construction history of the Hoosac Tunnel or surveyed the surviving Endicott batteries of the New England coast, or recorded the stone chamber sites of southern New Hampshire before residential development erased them, have performed a genuinely important service for the historical understanding of the region. Their work tends to be local in focus and modest in claim, and it rarely generates the popular attention attracted by claims of ancient Celtic stone temples. But it is considerably more reliable, and it has preserved information about the documentary underground of New England that would otherwise have been lost. There is a particular kind of investigator whose work deserves special mention here, the local historian. New England has a strong tradition of local historical societies, and the historians who have worked within that tradition over the past century and a half have often been the only people paying systematic attention to the underground spaces of their particular communities. The cellar appears in a deed description from 1752, but has no surviving surface trace. The mill passage that is mentioned in a 19th century company report, but has been built over and forgotten. The ice house foundation that appears on an 1895 survey map, but is no longer identified in any later record. These are the kinds of details that local historians, working through property records and town meeting minutes and probate inventories and surveying records and newspaper archives, have sometimes been able to recover and preserve. Their work is not glamorous. It does not attract documentary filmmakers or viral internet attention. But it is the foundation on which any honest understanding of New England's underground landscape must ultimately rest. One of the most striking human stories in the history of underground New England is not about discovery at all, but about construction, and about the men who built the Hoosac Tunnel through the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts over 22 years beginning in 1851. These were not engineers with clean offices and precise instruments, though the engineers who designed the tunnel were both precise and ambitious. They were miners and drillers and blasters, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland and from the mining communities of Cornwall in England. Working with hand drills and black powder in the early years, and then with nitroglycerine-based blasting compounds in the later phases of construction, including the first significant American use of nitroglycerin in an engineering project, which occurred at the Hoosac Tunnel in 1866. The conditions inside the tunnel during construction were genuinely dangerous. Men died in explosions, in cave-ins, and in flooding incidents. A major disaster in 1867 killed 13 men when a central shaft flooded, trapping them underground. The construction of the Hoosac Tunnel was not, for the men who actually dug it, a story of romantic mystery. It was a story of hard and dangerous labor, of physical courage and endurance, and of the human cost of great infrastructure. When the tunnel was finally completed in 1875, the celebration was genuine. It had taken longer and cost more than anyone had originally estimated, as large engineering projects invariably do, and the lives it had consumed were real lives, not historical abstractions. The men who built New England's underground are, in many ways, the most important people in this story. Not the amateur theorists, not the folklore collectors, not the documentary filmmakers, but the farmers who dug their cellars, by hand the mill workers who maintained the power canal systems, the quarrymen who cut incline passages through solid granite, the immigrant miners who drilled the Hoosac Tunnel foot by foot through the Berkshire Hills. The underground of New England is their work. It reflects their labor, their ingenuity, their practical problem-solving, and the historical conditions, economic, environmental, social, in which they lived. Understanding that is the beginning of understanding what the evidence can actually tell us about what lies beneath the ground. There is a discipline to honest historical investigation that is not always obvious from the outside. It involves, at its core, a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, including to conclusions that are less dramatic, less satisfying, and less useful to a good story than the alternatives. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty, to say plainly that the record is incomplete, to resist the very human pressure to fill gaps with imagination rather than acknowledging them as gaps. And it requires a clear understanding of what different kinds of evidence can and cannot establish, because not all evidence is equal, and not all questions can be answered with the same degree of confidence. When historians and archaeologists approach the underground spaces of New England, they work with several distinct categories of evidence, each with its own strengths and its own limitations. Understanding those categories and understanding how they fit together or sometimes fail to fit together is the most reliable path to an honest picture of what lies beneath the New England landscape. The most reliable category of evidence is the documentary record. Property deeds, surveying records. Town meeting minutes, probate inventories, company records, engineering surveys, newspaper accounts, insurance maps, and the many other forms of written and printed record that New England's well-documented history has produced. These are the primary tools of the historical researcher, and they are, when they survive, remarkably informative. A property deed that describes a structure as a root cellar located at a specific distance and orientation from the main house on a specific date constitutes direct evidence of the structure's purpose and its period of construction. A mill company record that lists the construction of an underground connection between two buildings with the dimensions of the passage and the materials used is similarly direct. An insurance map, the large-scale commercial maps produced by the Sanborn Map Company and its predecessors from the 1860s onward, primarily for the use of fire insurance companies, often shows the footprints of underground structures and basements in considerable detail, providing a snapshot of the urban underground at a specific point in time. The problem with the documentary record in the context of New England's underground spaces is its uneven survival. The documentary record is richest for institutional and commercial structures, for mills, for military installations, for churches and public buildings, and thinnest for the most common and most ordinary underground structures, the root cellars and farm cellars and springhouses and ice houses of the rural agricultural landscape. These structures were so ordinary, so commonplace, that they rarely generated the kind of documentation that survives. A farmer who dug a root cellar in the hillside behind his house in 1780 did not typically file a report with the County Historical Society. He simply dug it, used it, passed it on to his children, and eventually left it behind when the farm was abandoned. The cellar remains. The record does not. This gap in the documentary record is what creates the space for alternative interpretations of stone chambers and similar structures. If a structure has no surviving documentary context, no deed reference, no surveying description, no written account of its construction, then its age and purpose must be established through other means. And the other means available to researchers are more laborious and in many cases less conclusive. Physical evidence, the evidence of construction technique, material, tool marks, and the physical relationship of the structure to its landscape context, is the primary alternative to documentary evidence. A skilled archaeologist or architectural historian examining a stone chamber can often make reasonable inferences about when it was built based on the tools apparently used in its construction, the type of mortar, if any is present, the specific techniques of stone dressing and wall construction, and the general consistency of the structure's design with known examples of a particular period and tradition. Iron tool marks, for instance, are consistent with post-contact construction in a New England context. The indigenous peoples of the region did not work iron before European contact. The presence of iron staining or iron tool signatures in the stonework of a chamber is therefore evidence, though not conclusive proof, of colonial or later construction. The absence of such evidence is less informative, since some colonial dry-laid construction involved no iron tools directly applied to the stone faces. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of the carbon-14 isotope in organic materials to establish when those materials were last alive, is one of the most powerful dating tools available to archaeologists, but its application to stone structures requires the presence of datable organic material in direct association with the construction. Charcoal from a hearth, seeds from a floor deposit, wood from a timber element, these can be dated if they survive. But stone itself cannot be radiocarbon dated, and the charcoal found in the soil around or beneath a stone structure may predate, post-date, or be entirely unrelated to the construction of the structure itself. The radiocarbon dates obtained from some New England stone chamber sites have been disputed for exactly this reason. The dates tell us that organic material of a certain age was present at the site, but they do not necessarily tell us when the stone features were constructed. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, can be applied to wooden elements of historic structures and can sometimes establish construction dates with remarkable precision, in some cases down to the specific year or even the season in which the timber was cut. The technique has been applied extensively to New England's colonial and post-colonial wooden structures, including some of the oldest surviving houses in the region, with considerable success. But its application to underground stone structures is limited, since most of them either never had significant wooden elements or have lost any wood that was originally present to rot and decay. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other geophysical survey techniques have been applied to some New England sites and can sometimes reveal subsurface features, buried walls, pits, disturbed soil without excavation. These techniques have improved significantly in recent decades and are increasingly used in archaeological survey. But they require careful interpretation, since the anomalies they detect are not always what they appear to be, and they work better in some soil and geological conditions than others. The most informative approach to any underground site is a combination of documentary research, systematic archaeological excavation, and physical analysis of the existing structure. The kind of integrated investigation that is expensive, time-consuming, and requires the involvement of specialists from multiple disciplines. This kind of full investigation has been applied to relatively few of New England's stone chamber sites, which is one reason that the scholarly consensus on the chambers, while favoring colonial agricultural origins for most of them, has been difficult to establish with the kind of specific site-by-site documentation that would satisfy all parties. For the industrial underground, the mill canals, the quarry passages, the railroad tunnels, the military installations, the evidentiary situation is generally much stronger. These structures are typically well documented in their construction and use. Their physical character is consistent with their documented function, and their relationship to the broader landscape of 19th and early 20th century New England is traceable through both the documentary and physical record. The challenges with the industrial underground are less about establishing what the structures are and more about ensuring that the surviving physical remains are identified, recorded, and where appropriate protected before development, deterioration, or simple neglect removes them from the accessible record. The urban underground presents a different set of evidentiary challenges. The buried layers of New England cities are in many cases accessible only through the disruptive process of excavation, which typically occurs in the context of construction projects rather than archaeological investigations. The regulatory framework of federal historic preservation law, specifically Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties, including subsurface archaeological sites, has created a mechanism for archaeological investigation in advance of federally connected construction. This framework has generated significant archaeological findings in Boston, Providence, and other New England cities over the past several decades. But the coverage is uneven. Not all urban construction is federally connected, and the private development that has continued at a rapid pace in New England cities has not always been subject to archaeological review. What the evidence, taken as a whole, can actually tell us about New England's underground is something like this. The region contains a genuine, diverse, historically significant underground landscape that reflects the practical ingenuity and the industrial ambition of successive generations of inhabitants. Most of what has been called mysterious in that landscape is susceptible to ordinary historical explanation, if one takes the time to look at the right records and to apply the right analytical tools. Some structures remain genuinely uncertain in their origins, not because the evidence points toward extraordinary explanations, but because the ordinary evidence is incomplete. And a small number of structures and sites present features that careful researchers have not yet fully explained, features that deserve continued investigation conducted with the methodological rigor that the subject requires. The underground of New England is not the product of lost civilizations, ancient voyages, or suppressed historical secrets. It is the product of human beings, farmers and millers and miners and military engineers and city builders, responding to the demands of a specific landscape in specific historical circumstances. That is not a disappointing conclusion. It is, if anything, more interesting than the alternative, because the actual history of how human beings have shaped this particular landscape layer by layer. From the first colonial dugouts through the great mill canals to the buried subway tunnels and the Cold War concrete bunkers, is a story rich enough and strange enough and humanly significant enough to sustain any amount of quiet attention. But there is one more honest thing to say before we leave the question of evidence entirely. Not everything has been found. Not everything has been documented. And some of what lies beneath the ground in New England may, for reasons that have nothing to do with secrecy or conspiracy, remain genuinely unknown. Not every underground space in New England has been found. This is not a dramatic statement. It is simply a fact, and a fact that is worth sitting with for a moment. Because it tends to get lost in the back and forth between the enthusiasts who insist that tremendous secrets lie hidden beneath the ground and the skeptics who insist that everything is accounted for and everything is ordinary. The truth is somewhere quieter than either of those positions. Some things have not been found, not because they are being kept secret, and not necessarily because they are extraordinary, simply because the processes that bury and conceal underground spaces are real and ongoing, and because the resources available for systematic investigation of those spaces are limited. Consider first the ordinary mechanisms of loss. A root cellar built into a hillside in rural Vermont in 1810 served a farming family for perhaps 2 or 3 generations. By the 1880s, the family may have moved west, following the great agricultural migration that drained so much of upland New England of its farming population during the second half of the 19th century. The farmhouse, left unoccupied and unmaintained, deteriorated over the following decades. The roof failed. The floor collapsed. The walls settled. By the time the second-growth forest, the scrubby birch and maple that reclaims abandoned New England farmland with remarkable speed, had grown up around the site, the house itself was a rubble of rotted wood and tumbled fieldstone barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. But the root cellar, built into the hillside with dry-laid granite walls, may have survived, its earth cover protecting it, its stone structure resistant to the decay that destroyed the wooden house. It sits in the forest, now its entrance partly collapsed, partly hidden by a century of leaf litter and encroaching vegetation known, perhaps to the occasional deer hunter or mushroom forager, but not documented in any historical survey, not appearing on any map more recent than the 1895 atlas that shows the farm in operation. Multiply that root cellar by the thousands of farm sites that were abandoned across upland New England between roughly 1840 and 1920. The scale of rural abandonment in New England during this period was enormous. Historians estimate that the region lost a substantial fraction of its farming population to westward migration during these decades, and the landscape that had been cleared and cultivated over 2 centuries of agricultural effort was returned, acre by acre, to forest. The stone walls that line those abandoned fields are the most visible legacy of that vanished agricultural world. The underground structures that served those farms are less visible and less surveyed. How many of them survive, in what condition, in what form, is genuinely not known with any precision. State archaeological surveys and historical land use studies have documented portions of this landscape, but the coverage is incomplete and in many areas barely begun. The same processes of loss and concealment apply to the industrial underground, though the mechanisms are somewhat different. The covering over of mill canals and industrial waterways, which we have already noted in Providence and in the mill cities of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, happened in many places without systematic documentation of what was being covered. The assumption in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was that industrial infrastructure that was no longer useful simply needed to be disposed of efficiently, and the idea that it might constitute a significant historical resource worth documenting before destruction was not yet a widely shared value. The result is that some portions of New England's industrial underground were sealed or demolished or built over without any record of what they contained, and the physical evidence they might have provided is no longer accessible. In Boston, the expansion of the urban fabric over the filled tidal areas has created underground conditions that are genuinely complex and genuinely incompletely understood. The deposits beneath the Back Bay and the South End and other filled neighborhoods are a mixture of fill materials from various periods. Buried organic layers representing the original tidal flat surface, and in some cases, the remains of structures built on the fill at various points in the 19th century and subsequently buried by later development. The water table in these areas is close to the surface, and the wooden pile foundations of many 19th century buildings extend down into the organic layer, a fact that has practical implications for building preservation and that has also incidentally preserved organic materials in the buried layer that would otherwise have decayed. The archaeology of Boston's filled neighborhoods is a subject that has generated interesting research, but remains far from exhaustively studied. The military underground presents a specific kind of incompleteness. Some of the Cold War underground infrastructure in New England remains at least partially classified, or at least not fully documented in publicly accessible records. The locations and general character of most of the major installations are known, but the details of their construction, their contents, and their current condition are not always a matter of public record. This is not the same as saying that vast secret underground complexes exist beneath the New England landscape. In defiance of any public documentation, the scale of Cold War underground construction in New England, while significant, is broadly consistent with what is known about the National Program of Civil Defense Infrastructure during that period. But the detailed picture has not been fully assembled from the available declassified records, and the physical condition of many of these installations, which have in many cases been unoccupied and unmaintained for decades, is not always known. There is also the category of sites that are known to exist, but are not accessible for investigation. Flooded quarries, of which there are a number in New England, may contain underwater evidence of mining operations, equipment, and underground passages that are simply not accessible without significant diving or pumping operations. Some of the older surviving mill buildings contain basement and subbasement spaces that have been sealed off from the portions of the buildings that remain in active use, spaces that may contain surviving evidence of the original industrial infrastructure, including connections to old power canal systems or drainage channels, that have simply not been examined because no one has had a reason to open them. Some private properties contain underground features, old cellars, stone chambers, drainage channels, that their owners know about but have not made available for public survey or historical investigation. None of these categories of the unknown should be understood as implying that remarkable or extraordinary things necessarily lie hidden in them. The root cellar in the Vermont forest is almost certainly a root cellar. The sealed section of a mill basement probably contains the remains of ordinary industrial infrastructure. The underwater quarry workings are likely to be what the surface evidence of the quarry already suggests. The default assumption, in the absence of specific contrary evidence, should be the ordinary one. What is unknown is not extraordinary. But there is something genuinely moving about the existence of the unknown, even when the most likely content of that unknown is perfectly ordinary. The root cellar in the forest exists, whether or not anyone finds it. The sealed mill passage continues in the dark, whether or not anyone opens it. The buried tidal layer beneath the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston holds its organic remnants in the cold and wet, regardless of whether anyone ever excavates them. The unknown is not a void. It is a presence, the presence of the past, persisting in the ground, patient in a way that only stone and soil can be patient, indifferent to whether or not human curiosity ever comes to look at it. There is a particular kind of quietness to this thought. The landscape keeps its evidence regardless of whether we ask for it. The ground remembers, in its own way, what happened above and beneath it. And the fact that we do not know everything that lies buried in the hills and cities of New England is not a failure or a frustration. It is simply the honest condition of living in a landscape with a long history and a finite human capacity for attention. The things we have not found are part of the story too. They are perhaps the quietest part of it. There is an hour in late autumn when the light leaves the New England countryside in a particular way. It goes slowly at first. The sky above the tree line holding a pale gray luminosity long after the sun has set behind the western hills, and then all at once the darkness fills in from the east. From the ocean, from the direction the first settlers came. From the direction the old ships once traveled with their holds full of dry goods and their passengers full of hope and uncertainty. The stars appear. The temperature drops. The granite outcrops that stand at the edges of the old fields hold a little of the day's warmth for a while, and then release it and become cold and dark and part of the night. This is the landscape we have been walking through in a way for the whole of this documentary. The surface of it is familiar enough. The stone walls, the old foundations, the second-growth forest reclaiming the cleared fields, the distant light of a farmhouse or a town. But beneath that surface, as we have been gradually learning, there is another landscape entirely. A landscape of cellars and passages and industrial waterways and military vaults and buried city streets and sealed quarry tunnels and stone chambers whose original purpose has been argued about for generations. A landscape that is simultaneously entirely ordinary and, when you think about it carefully enough, genuinely remarkable. What is remarkable is not that the underground spaces of New England are mysterious. Most of them, as we have seen, are not particularly mysterious, or at least their mystery is the ordinary mystery of familiar things looked at with unfamiliar attention. A root cellar is a root cellar, built by a farming family against the practical demands of a hard climate, and there is nothing secret about it. A mill drainage channel is a piece of industrial engineering designed by practical people to solve a practical problem, and its existence underground is a function of hydraulic necessity rather than any desire for concealment. A military magazine is exactly what it looks like, a reinforced storage space for explosive materials, built with thick walls and buried under earth, because the nature of its contents demanded both separation and protection. What is genuinely remarkable is the accumulation. The fact that each generation of inhabitants of this landscape, the indigenous peoples who moved through it for thousands of years before European contact, the colonial farmers who cleared it and built their houses and their underground storage on it, the industrial entrepreneurs who harnessed its rivers and quarried its stone and ran their railroads through its mountains, the city builders who layered their infrastructure beneath the streets of Boston and Providence and New Haven and Portland. Each of these generations added their own layer to the underground record of the region. Each of them left something beneath the surface, whether they intended to or not. And those layers, accumulated over centuries of human habitation, constitute something that deserves more attention and more care than it typically receives. The indigenous peoples of New England, the Wampanoag, the Abenaki, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, and the many other nations whose descendants still live in the region, left underground evidence of their presence in the form of archaeological features. Storage pits, hearth deposits, the post molds, and floor surfaces of structure cites the ash and charcoal of cooking fires. The lithic debris of tool, making the bone and seed remains of meals. This evidence, recovered through careful archaeological excavation at sites across the region, constitutes the most direct record of human life in New England before European contact, a record that extends back at least 12,000 years to the end of the last glaciation and probably further. It is a record not of mysterious underground spaces, but of the entirely human and entirely unremarkable daily life of people who lived on this land for millennia before anyone thought of building a cellar. The colonial farmers who followed left their own layer: the cellars, the root cellars, the drainage channels, the ice houses, the well shafts, the privy pits, the foundations of houses and barns and mills, and churches that successive generations built, modified, demolished, and built over again. This layer is the most ambiguous, in a way, because it is the layer most subject to the competing interpretations. The farming families who built their ordinary agricultural infrastructure, and the later observers who looked at that infrastructure through the lens of a more dramatic story. Understanding that layer requires distinguishing between what was built and what was imagined, which is the work we have been doing through most of this documentary. The industrial layer, the mill canals, the quarry tunnels, the railroad passages, the waterworks and sewer systems, and utility corridors of the 19th and early 20th centuries, is the layer most thoroughly buried beneath the modern landscape. The surface of the New England mill city looks, in many places, nothing like it looked at the height of the industrial period. The mills themselves have been converted into apartments and office space and restaurants, or they have been demolished entirely. The power canal systems are routed underground or have been filled in. The quarries have been abandoned and flooded, and in some cases converted to swimming holes or industrial sites. The railroad tunnels are still in use, mostly, but their surrounding infrastructure has changed almost beyond recognition. And beneath all of this modernized surface, the underground industrial layer continues, the granite-lined canals carrying water in the dark, the brick sewer arches holding the weight of the streets above, the quarry inclines descending through solid rock toward floors that no longer see daylight. The military layer, the most recent of the major underground additions to the New England landscape, sits above all the others in the physical stratigraphy, but carries a particular historical weight. The Cold War bunkers and the Endicott batteries and the older masonry forts and their gunpowder magazines are the underground spaces that most directly express the anxiety of their time. The anxieties of a coastal settlement always aware of its vulnerability to seaborne threat. The anxieties of an industrial society increasingly aware of its technological capacity for self-destruction. They were built against fears that were real in their time, and they were built with a thoroughness and a seriousness that speaks to how real those fears were. Many of them were never used in actual combat. Most of them are now open to the elements, their iron hardware rusting, their concrete cracking, their passages dark and wet, and slowly returning to the granite hillsides they were cut into. They are, in their abandonment, among the most melancholy of New England's underground spaces, built against catastrophe, surviving it, and now standing as monuments to a kind of vigilance that history did not ultimately require. There is, running through all of these layers, a thread of human persistence that is perhaps the most honest thing this documentary can point toward. The people who built these underground spaces, all of them, from the colonial farmer shaping a root cellar in a New Hampshire hillside to the Irish immigrant miner drilling through the Berkshire granite of the Hoosac Tunnel face, were solving problems. They were cold and they needed to store food. They needed power for their mills. They needed to move their railroads through mountains. They needed to protect their harbors. They needed to supply their cities with water and remove their waste. These were not romantic motivations. They were practical ones. And the practical response to each of these practical needs produced an underground landscape of genuine depth and genuine interest, not because it is mysterious, but because it is thoroughly, recognizably human. The mystery, to whatever extent it exists, is not underground. It is in us. It is in the persistent human tendency to look at the ordinary evidence of other people's practical lives and see something more than ordinary, to feel standing at the entrance to a root cellar in the autumn dusk, that something more than turnips was stored here. That the darkness inside is the darkness of something significant rather than the darkness of a space where a farming family kept their cider barrels through the winter. That feeling is not wrong, exactly. It is just slightly misaimed. What is significant is not the hidden secret that the tunnel was supposed to conceal. What is significant is the life that surrounded it, the cold, the effort, the practical ingenuity, the long human story of people trying to survive and build and continue in a particular landscape at a particular time. The granite of New England has been here for hundreds of millions of years. The ice sheet came and went over it, spending tens of thousands of years reshaping it and then retreating northward in a matter of centuries. The indigenous peoples arrived and lived with it for thousands of years, leaving their evidence in the ground and their presence in the land. The colonial settlers came and began breaking it apart and stacking it into walls and building their foundations into it and their cellars beneath it. The Industrial Revolution came and tunneled through it and quarried it and built great stone canals to carry the power of the rivers that cut through it. And through all of this, the granite endured, cold, patient, indifferent in the geological sense of the word, holding the evidence of everything that happened above and below it in its layered record. That record is not complete. Some of it has been lost to time, to development, to the simple entropy that works on human constructions as it works on everything else. Some of it remains to be found by archaeologists and historians and careful observers who are willing to look past the legend to the more interesting reality beneath it. And some of it will remain unknown, not hidden, not secret, but simply buried in the quiet dark beneath the stone and soil of a landscape that has been holding human history in its lower layers for a very long time. The night has settled fully now over the old fields and the second-growth forests and the hill towns and the mill city neighborhoods and the harbor islands with their old forts. The granite outcrops are cold. The stone walls run through the dark. Somewhere in a Vermont hillside, a root cellar that no one has opened in a century and a half sits in its granite-lined silence. Somewhere beneath Providence Street, an old brick arch of a 19th-century sewer drainage channel holds its shape in the wet ground. Somewhere in the western Massachusetts hills, the Hoosac Tunnel carries the vibration of a passing freight train through the same mountain that took 22 years and so many lives to pierce. The underground of New England is not a mystery to be solved. It is a landscape to be understood, slowly, carefully, with the patience that the ground itself models so well. It is the accumulated evidence of human beings trying to live in a particular place across a very long time. And it is, if you listen to it quietly enough, one of the most interesting stories this part of the world has to tell. The stone is old, the night is quiet, and somewhere beneath the ground, the work of all those hands continues to hold. Rest now. The ground remembers.